Welcome to Balfour Marr. My name's Tom Marr, and in today's session we're going to cover franchise agreements, reviews and advice. It's a very popular area of business and law, and commonly clients come to us and approach us wanting advice on their documents and understanding what's involved in getting into a franchise business. Quite often also they may simply be referred to us and said, you need to go get legal advice and sign a certificate. Now, one of the main problems we see with that is that people aren't understanding that the documents that you're presented with are very voluminous. You'll get a franchise agreement, a disclosure document, which statutorily they're required to give that under the franchise code, as well as related information and documents, the guarantee advice statements, independent advice, and so forth. Particularly to understand also that there's more to a franchise business. It could, of course, be a new franchise, or it could be an existing franchise business. So if it's an existing franchise business, you're going to need to have a purchase of business agreement as well. And it's quite likely that you're buying that off another franchisee. So in itself, you're going to have to do due diligence on that franchise business as well as the franchise system. In addition to that, if it's based in a premises, you're actually going to need to be looking at the lease documentation as well. So people come to me and say, well, Tom, how much to do that? I say, well, hang on, I haven't even seen the documents. I'm not even sure what it is. But most importantly, have you read the documents first? That's the number one problem we see out there. A lot of times people have spent all this time looking at it, they're excited, they want to get into it, they've been sold on the business, they love the system, of course, because that's why they're there, and they've got to that stage where they want to talk to a lawyer, and then they seem to think it's just some perfunctory exercise that a lawyer's going to say, oh, it's X dollars and come in and I'll sign a certificate. The whole purpose of going to a lawyer is to obtain advice. And in order for us to provide advice, we need to review the information, we need to explain that to yourselves, you need to understand what's involved in all of those aspects, and then make an informed decision. Possibly at the end of that, you may actually decide, well, hang on, I'm not so sure, or I need more information. Most commonly, I'll also say, before you even come to us, you need to talk to your accountant about this and to make sure you've done your figures, you've done your budgets, your cash flow, your lending and so forth. And that in itself has a whole other situation that arises. If you're buying a franchise business, how are you funding it? 9 times out of 10, it's going to be used finance from a third-party financier like a bank or so forth. So that in itself requires another set of reviews. So the main thing that I say to anyone before they even come to us is, actually, have you read the documents? The reason why is obviously there's no point in getting legal advice, and of course, unfortunately but necessarily, we charge for our time on these matters. But if you read the documents and then you check through it and then you're actually uncomfortable with it or uncertain, or you need more information, or you want to discuss it with your accountant, well, you don't need to invest those monies in getting legal advice yet. You need to go back and discuss that and clarify that with the franchisor, the seller franchisee, the lender, the lessor. Now, you'll also note that I've mentioned about 4 or 5 other parties, and that's one of the problems that arise as well. They're all different masters. They all actually are separate, of course, to the franchise business, the franchisor, the franchise business owner. And of course, with the franchise business, I should point out, you might have staff with that as well that you may be taking over. The lease of the premises with the lessor, the bank and so forth. Now, once you've read all the documents and information, to make sure you have everything you need. Of course, it is quite bamboozling, for want of a better term, how much you get. And I must say, and if you haven't gathered already, to buy an existing franchise business with a lease of premises under finance is probably one of the most complex types of business acquisitions for small, medium business owners. There's just so many parts to it and so much documentation. You're talking in excess of 200 pages of information and documentation. And yes, it is in lots of legalese, there's lots of technical information and so forth. So it's very important to understand it's ultimately yourself that is going to be signing those documents, whether through a new entity such as a company or a family trust, but quite likely also in a guarantee capacity and so forth. So making sure you've got all the information, you've understood it as best as you can in plain English. Then the trick is to make notes of things that you're not sure about, you don't understand, or you disagree with. If there are points that you can go back and discuss that with the franchisor or the seller of business or whatever, do that, get and clarify that aspect. So when you come to a lawyer and you're wanting that review and advice, the trick is to make sure all the information's there and available. We can't just review, say, a franchise agreement on its own if you're buying the business and the lease. It would be negligent for us because you might say, oh, the franchise agreement's great, the fees are excellent, But if you look at the lease of premises, it might expire in 2 years and there's no option to renew, or they might be redeveloping it. So you might end up buying a business, but you can't be at that location. And then to have to relocate, you'd have to factor in potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars and so forth. So it's very important to understand the entire transaction. There's just no point in doing it in piecemeal, because you'd actually end up spending more money on legal fees and accounting fees and everything if you did it at one stage. In fact, having a bank involved to lend money to your prospective franchise business, which is not always the case. Quite often they are actually going to lend it against some other assets like your home and so forth, and then you on-lend it. And that's a subject of another topic and seminar I've done before, so you can look that up. But coming back to this franchise agreement review and advice, and with the certification, it's then, if you've got everything right and you feel, look, yes, I'm still prepared to go ahead, I'm really interested, I've read it myself, I've gone and got that accounting advice. So then you provide it to the lawyer and you say to them, okay, well, look, what's involved and how much does it cost? Well, once I get that information, then I can look through that. And what I normally propose, and it's the best use of your time and money and my time and expertise, is actually to undertake what I call a traffic light review. So what I do is I go through and I read all the documents, which is obviously my duty of care, and I address any of those questions, queries, or concerns you have specifically. Plus, of course, the things that you don't know, aren't aware of, or uncommon. And so what I use is, when I said a traffic light system, I use red means that's really quite dangerous or really unusual. Yellow means, look, we need to discuss it, or I need to highlight and bring it to your attention. And green means, well, look, you've had a win there that's quite unusually beneficial to you as a franchisee. And let's work with that and understand that. Then what I do is I say, come in, let's have a meeting. It's best to do it face to face. You can do it by Skype, but I walk through, and what I've done then is, with the traffic light review, I've made the notes and inserted all that in there, and I address all your queries, concerns, and objectives, plus those other risks and opportunities. And it's very important to understand also, it's not just going into the franchise business, it's coming out. You've got to have end in mind. How am I going to realize the value in that franchise business? And generally the life cycle for franchisees no more than about 7 years, and that, in fact, it's getting shorter and shorter. And of course, a lot of times it's determined on if it's using a leased premises, determined on the length of the tenure in the leased premises. And for example, in a shopping centre, rarely nowadays do they give more than 5 years. So effectively, when you're buying it, you need to understand, for your return on investment, how are you going to realise that and get out of it at the end. And it's not just at the end. You can't sell it at 5 years with no guarantee that you're going to have a new lease. So you literally need to sometimes start thinking about selling it in the second or third year. Now, of course, you can negotiate with the lessor to get what's called an option or an extension for the lease and things like that. But all of that needs to be done at the front end, okay? So coming back to the certification, if you haven't gathered by now, it's not just merely some lawyer signing a document. If you needed someone to sign a document, it certainly wouldn't be a lawyer, because what they're wanting is our professional skill and expertise, and frankly, our professional indemnity policy put on the line to say, you've got advice, you've understood the risks and obligations and the limited benefits, but the benefits are all yours if it goes well. That's profitability. But if something goes bad, then what the franchisor is saying, or the bank's saying, or the lessor is saying is, you need to go back to your lawyer. They were responsible for explaining those risks and obligations and so forth. Obviously, I do all that, but it's not just always about, grey skies. It's also about blue skies. It's also about understanding how you can best own and operate that franchise business, going in, operating it, and exiting it. So with those things in mind, if you then understand all those risks, rights, obligations, and opportunities, and only then can a lawyer actually certify that you've understood their advice and signed that independent legal advice certification. Same for the guarantors. The guarantors quite often may be yourself and, say, your spouse or partner, because they want the franchisee entity, which will only generally own the franchise business assets, they'll want to have those fees and other obligations underwritten by some guarantees as well. So there will need to be guarantor advice, and the guarantor needs to understand the impacts and the risks associated with giving a guarantee to that franchise business. And remember, again, it's not just the franchise agreement, it's the lease, it's the finance, and so forth. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a prelude to what's involved in properly going through and reviewing a franchise business and looking to invest and buy into one, but also what's involved in properly engaging legal advice and expertise in going through a franchise business review.